Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Friendly Outsider. I'm Jay, the Friendly Outsider, and this is my podcast. You can find us on all the podcasting places. Since you're already listening to this, I'm guessing you already know that. That said, if you're watching it, you might want to listen to it on audio rather than watching it on video, and you can find all the links to everything on www.friendly-outsider.com. If you would like this podcast on a podcasting host or like system that it's not on, let me know and I'll get it on there pretty quick because that is what I do. So this is my first Tek Talk. This is all about podcasts. Well, maybe not all about podcasts, but some stuff about podcasts. I'm going to talk about them a little. This is for the layman, so if you don't know much about tech, I'm going to try and word this in ways that you can understand. Easily, but we'll see how it goes. If it is too technical, let me know so I can know in the future how to adjust it. Going back to my website, friendly-outsider.com, you can find all the links to subscribe and follow me on everything. You can donate to me on Patreon if you're so inclined to and enjoy what I do. And you can find out where to listen to it and read blogs as I start posting them, and etc., etc. So to move on, today's episode is about podcasts. And, I thought I'd start first with about my own background into podcasts, like how I got into them. So a few years back, I was talking to my friend Rob, aka the Sensei, and you'll find out why that is later on as I get to it. But I was talking to him one day, and I believe this was 2016 in the later part of the year. I started to say the fall, but as someone who just spent the last few years in Australia, seasons get a little weird when you're on the other hemisphere, and it's hard to make comparisons of times of the year with season because it's all the other way around. So that's why I switched from saying the fall, which is what I was thinking, or the autumn. I went to the latter part of the year. But anyways, so Rob introduced me to podcasts. He told me about the Joe Rogan podcast, and I'm like, the Joe Rogan podcast? I mean, I knew who he was. He was doing commentators for UFC, which I enjoy watching, and I was like, he has a podcast? Yeah. I was like, is it any good? Yeah, I listen to it all the time. I was like, how long is it? 3 hours? I was like, 3 hours? What does he do? Once a week? He's like, no, almost every day. I was like, every day? And I couldn't believe this. I mean, I heard of podcasts. People were talking about them and people were doing them, but I didn't really know what they were. I didn't know what they were about. I like Rob. He's my buddy, and he gave me a recommendation. So I started listening to the podcast, and it turned out he had a bunch of different famous people on it. And so he was already at like 800 episodes or something. I was like, 800 episodes. And so I went back and listened to some with famous people that I liked, and it was really quite interesting. And I found it, for me, it was really good because I was working. I had my own company in Japan at the time, and I was doing the work for my company as well as programming, but also, just various stuff. And podcasting, listen to the Joe Rogan podcast, I could plug it into my ears and listen to it while I was working, doing other stuff without having to focus on it too much. And if I wandered off in my brain for a while and then came back to it, it was okay. Maybe I missed some conversation, maybe not. But I just found that an interesting way to listen. For me, it worked well. I like to have sort of background noise while I work too, to sort of balance out the noise in my brain, I guess. And so I actually only listened to that podcast for a good year or more, maybe even. But over time, I started listening to a few more others, and I was like, oh, these are interesting. And I generally swing towards comedy podcasts, although I've listened to a few others, like sort of not murder mysteries, but like documentary type stuff about like past crimes and stuff like that. And I quite like it. And eventually, back to the Sensei, Rob, where I got into that, is we decided to do a podcast together, which is called Sensei and the Geek, which is still out there. If you'd like to see it, you can find it. I'm not going to push my other podcast because we don't do that one anymore, but that's about as much as I'll say. But when we did this podcast, it's about Japan, essentially. I mean, he and I both were long-termers in Japan at the time. I built the website around the podcast, and it was really quite technically difficult to figure out how to do everything, like how to link up to both how to like get the podcast onto the podcasting apps like Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts and stuff, but also just like how to link it to all the different social networking sites and Patreon to get paid and YouTube and blah blah blah. If you haven't I mean, I was able to do it. Some of it I had to figure out because this is what I did/do. But the average person isn't going to be able to do that because they're not a tech person like me. And it was difficult. And so I realized at this time, I was like, well, I see an opportunity there. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because I need to be full disclosure on this. I am currently building a platform on which people can host podcasts. And when I say people, it could be, Dave down the road who has no idea how to do anything technical whatsoever, just wants to log in and push record and record the podcast right there, to organizations that run multiple podcasts and need to be able to assign members of their organization to which podcast they're able to do which permissions on. So maybe on one podcast they're a blog author, and another one they're a blog editor or something like that. There's it can be all divvied up. So I'm building a platform like this that will allow podcasts to be hosted. So I do have a bit of a vested interest in this topic. Just thought that needed full disclosure. But and another point to this, the friendlyoutsider.com, friendly-outsider.com. I want to be clear, I somehow got the other domain name snagged on me. Friendly-outsider.com is actually hosted on my platform. So I created an account on my platform, and I've created friendly-outsider.com. It's not ready for the rest of the world to do that yet, because the account that I created basically lets you do a lot of stuff, which I need to break it down a little more. But this is what I'm working towards with my March 31st goal that I've set for myself, is to have a beta ready for that. Anyways, that's a personal thing. It's kind of getting off topic here. I just wanted to have my full disclosure there. So what I'm actually going to talk about in this here podcast is, first, what is a podcast? Which is kind of silly because you're listening to one, so you already have some sort of idea, but I'm just going to talk a bit about that some more. And what that term actually encompasses, because it's what it used to mean and what it now means have sort of changed a little bit. And then I'm going to explain a little bit about how podcasts are distributed, how the system works on the back end on a technical level, but I'm going to try and keep it to the layman's level so that, those of you who might not, or have your eyes glaze over generally when people talk about tech, can still understand it, and your eyes don't need to glaze over. And then I'll even add a couple words of lingo so that you can talk like the pros. And so then I'm going to talk about why I think podcasts matter, and and I think why they matter is also why they've gotten to where they are at the time, and I'll touch on that. And then I'm going to talk about how they're marketed and how they're promoted, and then finally how people are making money off them if they are, or what other motivations people have for doing podcasts, why they would do it. For example, Sensei and the Geek, we never made a cent off it, and I spent quite a bit, and I invested a lot of time, but it was just something fun to do. So let's start off with, what is a podcast? Now, for those of you on video, you'll notice I'm looking down a bit because I wanted this nice backdrop of snow for the thing, but I don't have anywhere to put my computer. But I'm trying to do this one-handed with my Mac. There's a good chance there's going to be a blooper reel here where I drop my Mac and break it and swear a lot and then have to cut that all out and go buy a new Mac and try this again. But I'm doing it anyways. So what is a podcast? So Wikipedia, it says, a podcast is an episodic series of digital audio files that a user can download in order to listen. Alternatively, the word podcast may refer to the individual component of such a series or to an individual media file. So, that actually covers it pretty good. Traditionally, when podcasts first came out, it was essentially just a file, or a series of files. You could look at it either way, but how they came out, there's different ways, and I'm going to actually touch on that a little bit. But really, at its core, that's what a podcast is. It's just an audio file that allows people to listen to it, and they're distributed so that people can listen to them in series, in an order, or at least in a list. So within the files, however, you start to get a little more things. So MP3 files allow for what's called metadata to be written to the file. And other file formats do as well, but MP3 is a pretty common one for podcasts. And when metadata is information in a file about the file. So for example, have you ever, sometimes on a car stereo, I've seen this might even be outdated information. That's one thing about being out of the society for a long time. I don't know if my references might be a little off sometime, but I've seen on car stereos where it'll have like the title of the track and the album, and then it'll even have a little like cover image of the album or whatever on there for you to see with the track. And that's what that is when someone saved that file, they also wrote metadata to the file, like the title and maybe a description even, and then the album name and then the year it came out. And they also included even an image file inside the audio file that is the cover image, so that when you play it on a stereo, you get that little icon with the cover image on the side. So that's all information. The file itself is an audio file. You listen to it, but there's metadata. It's data about the file that's written inside it. And actually, MP3s have a wide range of files, and there's a set range of files specifically. They're called IV. Well, now I'm having a blank out. IP3V2. You know, I work with this every day, and all of a sudden when I'm recording it live, well, not live, but I'm not going to pause it. I can't think of the name. Anyways, ID3 tags is what they're called. So, and it's on version 2. And so these tags there's like a set number of tags that you can put on, and therefore, because they're standardized, various audio players or even software or, you know, on the internet or even scrapers can pick up information about the file without actually playing the whole audio file. So this, for example, this would allow, say, Google to index audio files. Like, they can't hear the content, but they can still get a whole bunch of information, so that when you're searching for information about something, that audio file could potentially come up as a result, because the metadata says that it contains like the type of information you're looking for. So what happens with a podcast is someone records a podcast somewhere. Now, this could happen multiple ways, but the standard way is, well, I shouldn't even say the standard way. There's all sorts of ways. The way I'm doing it, which is the simple way, because I'm a one-man team right now, is I'm holding my iPhone right now, and I'm talking to my iPhone. And the great thing is we live in an age where iPhones are, phones have great cameras and videos in them, and we're able to do this. And what I will eventually do is I'll post this video to the YouTube channel for the Friendly Outsider, but then I'll actually strip the audio from the video, and I'll turn that into the podcast that gets put out on iTunes and everything. So now I've got an audio file. Now, some people will do that in a studio, and that's what I was going to say is the common way, but I don't know if that is the common way. I don't really know there's a lot of podcasts. I don't know, maybe what I'm doing is more common than that. I'm not too sure. But regardless of how it happens, somehow an audio file is generated, and that becomes the podcast. And then someone writes the metadata to the file, or they don't, which a lot of podcasters don't, because this is one of those technical hurdles I was talking about, which if you've never done this, figuring out how to do it's difficult, and you have to to get good software to do it, you have to pay for it, or if you're going to do it, like I do it on the command line, which is, you know, when you see in movies they're typing and it's just a black screen with the text on it. I mean, I deal with that, but that's a technical hurdle, right? So most people can't do these things. But anyways, if that step does happen, the tags are written, and then they upload the file somewhere public on the internet, so somewhere to a server. They you know, that could be anything. Now, some people use like SoundCloud, for example. When we did Sensei and the Geek, that's where we hosted it. You could also use Dropbox, and we tried that, and I switched off it for some reason. I don't remember exactly, but basically, if you have a way of getting a file onto the internet where people can access it, you can then have a podcast. Now, again, another technical hurdle, because most of you are probably saying, I don't know how to get a file somewhere on the internet. But I'm just kind of explaining how it works. I'll get to, well, actually, since I've already been very transparent about the fact that I'm building a platform, my platform will handle all the writing of the ID3 tags I was talking about, as well as handle the upload. You just click upload and upload a file, or you'll even be able to click record and record a podcast right then and there, and then have that become your podcast. But I digress. This is not entirely meant to be a sales pitch, but it's really meant to be about podcasts. But I mean, hey, I'm using the opportunity while I got it, because this is my platform, both the Friendly Outsider as well as the platform I'm building. So to move onwards with that, you will be able to do that. So the file has to get on the internet, or onto the internet somewhere where it's publicly accessible. And then you create a document. Just think like a Word document, even if you're, old school Windows user or whatnot, but just anything. And you create a document that basically says, all right, here is my podcast. My podcast is named The Friendly Outsider. Its whole website is friendly-outsider.com and blah, blah, blah. And I say about it, I give it a description. I say some other things. I say whether it's explicit or not, because some podcasts are and some aren't. And mine, I'm aiming to generally not be, although, hey, maybe I will have some where I check that box because I set up my system to allow me to check that explicit box. Anyways, and so, the document says a bunch of information about the podcast, and then it lists off all the episodes, each of the episodes of the podcast. And then now you have a document basically that is like, hey, this is the podcast, this is what it's about, here's each episode, and here's what each episode is about. And now you put that somewhere publicly accessible on the internet. And I'm going to stop repeating that my system can do this, because you can just understand that because I understand all this stuff and I know it needs to be done, I'm building a system that can handle that. So to skip on to that, so you have a document now. You have two things. You have your audio file that is your episode, and then you have another document that says where all your episodes are. And when I say where they are, I'm going to hit my first technical term here. This is called a URL. I think most people have probably heard of this. It's universal resource locator. So basically it means one URL is like, that's unique. It's always going to be unique, and so that's why and anywhere on the internet, if you use that same address, you're going to get the thing that's at that address. So that's why it's universal, and it's a resource, which is a web page, is what they call it, and it's a locator. It's finding it. So URL, and so now I've got it. And so the document, this is the next technical word I'm going to put in there. That document I talked about that describes the podcast and says what the list of episodes are, that's called an RSS feed. And that's about all I need to really say about that. But this is a standardized format that you write a certain way, and it talks about the podcast. So the next thing I do is I've got my document that says, hey, this is my podcast, and I've put it up. I've pasted it on a public billboard where anyone can see it, and that's what giving it a URL is. And so now it's on this billboard, and I walk over to Apple Podcasts, and I knock on the door, and I say, hey, Apple Podcasts. And they're like, who are you? And I say, well, I'm Jay Friendly. And they're like, yeah? Do you have a website? And I say, yes, my website is friendly-outsider.com. And they're like, okay, well, here, what's your username? And we'll give you a password so you can get in next time. I'm like, okay. So I go on and like, okay, go to that desk. That's where you register your podcast. So I walk over to that desk and I say, hey, guys, I have a new podcast. And they say, do you now? Where is your podcast? And I say, that document, my RSS feed, is I posted it on the public billboard app, and I tell them the URL where that RSS feed is. And they say, okay, we'll check on that. And so every 15 minutes or so, they send their guy over there. They say, hey, Stanley, run over and check and see if the Friendly Outsider has any new podcasts. And Stanley runs over there and he comes back and he's like, yep or nope. And so whenever I have a new podcast, I just go paste it on that same board. And so anytime Stanley checks and there's a new one, he runs back and he says, yeah, there's a new one. And they write it down in their books, and now they have a record of that podcast. So that's my simple way of explaining how it works, is the RSS feed. I just update that every time I create a new podcast on the site, and Apple periodically checks that RSS feed. Now, I've also gone to Google, and I've gone to Stitcher, and I've gone to Spotify, and I've gone to Blueberry and all the other ones, and I've done the same process. I've said, hey, I've got this podcast, and you can find the RSS feed at this URL. And so they periodically check, and if there's a new one, then they list it on their app, the iTunes, the Apple Podcast app, or the Google Play app, that's not what it's called, but whichever app you're using to listen to your podcast. And so if someone tells me that they found a podcasting app that doesn't have the Friendly Outsider, what I'll do then is I just Google, I say, whatever named app, subscribe or register podcast, and then you get a page on Google and it says you can register your podcast at this feed, and you paste your RSS feed in, and there you go. Often you have to create an account, but sometimes they've already found it and they say claim this podcast. So that I found that to be an interesting one. Like somehow they've already discovered, and mine's only been up for a couple of weeks, but they've already discovered my podcast. So that's the simple way to understand how a podcast feed works. the podcaster puts the audio file up somewhere on the internet, and then creates a list that says what episodes there are, and the apps go in, they check it periodically to see if there's a new one. Then when a user presses play on their app, they actually just directly stream the file from wherever it is on the internet to the user. So you right now, you're listening to this podcast likely on my server, and because, if it's in the future sometime, maybe it's changed, who knows. But at the time when I've at least put this out, it's being hosted on my own personal servers, and you're being streamed through the whichever app you're listening to listen to that. All right, so let's see, where was I at? Now, the interesting thing is that what this means is podcasts are now essentially like on-demand radio. Like what I'm doing right now, what I'm talking to you people, which is kind of a rude way to say it, isn't it? But I'm talking to the people who are listening to this. Let's phrase that a little more politely. And this is essentially radio, as it used to be, but I don't have a company. All I've got is a phone, and I've got a server now that I'm going to upload this to, but I'm trying to set up my thing so that you don't even need a server. You just need to log in and have an account on my system, right? And so it means that it's brought the power of communication to the masses, to everyone. Well, not everyone. Some people don't have a phone or any kind of recording device, so I'm being a little presumptuous with that. But, to the masses by far. The masses are now able to broadcast to other masses. It's a many-to-many relationship. And this is something we've never had throughout the history of humanity. So this is a new thing. On-demand radio. And it's interesting, if you think back in the 80s, I believe late 80s, with Christian Slater, there was a movie called Pump Up the Volume, and he was running like an underground radio out of his garage or something like that was like rebel and fight the power and blah blah blah. And I loved that movie at the time, and in the end they chased him down. They used like triangulation of his thing to figure out where he was broadcasting from. They came and crashed it in, and they took him down, and it was like a real rebel movie. As the outsider, the friend of the outsider, really appealed to me. I quite liked it. But now I'm doing what Christian Slater was doing, and potentially to a wider audience. Probably not, in his little local thing, he had a bunch of people. That was the whole point of the movie. But I'm literally speaking to the entire planet right now because, well, that's not entirely true, but a good portion of it will have access to me talking about this. Now, of course, they're not all going to listen to me, but, the point is made. And so, podcasts, while they are audio files, what's interesting is there is a way somehow to do it with video now as well. So I've only seen it. CNN had like a CNN 10 app, and it's like every day or like 5 days a week they put out like a quick little 10-minute episode that like just gives some of the world news of the day, and I found it quite interesting. But they embed video into it somehow, and I actually haven't really dug into it any deeper on this because I'm not just at that point yet. So I don't know if they're actually creating a video file and then on their list of episodes on their RSS feed that they're just listing to a video file, or if they're actually embedding video maybe as metadata into the audio file, just from a purely what's that called? Educated guess, being a technical guy. I'd say I guess probably the former is more likely because, you could theoretically embed video as metadata into an audio file, but then what's the audio file? So I don't think that is. I just know that when you play that, maybe they're doing a video file actually for the cover art, because that's actually, I don't know. I'm not going to speculate anymore. And one of the, podcasts, they've often are talking, but one thing I've realized is they could potentially be for other avenues as well. Like I listened to a comedy podcast that travels around a little bit, and they record their comedy show live, and then they put it out as podcasts. And DJs could do this as well. I talked to a DJ the other day here in Vancouver, and he puts out a mix every week. And so he puts it onto SoundCloud, but you could easily, like he's putting his mixes, once a week he has them. You could easily just create the RSS document that lists off his DJ episodes and then tell it to all the podcasting services, Apple Podcasts or whatever, and then all of a sudden it increases their listenership because these podcasts, I'm going to call them directories, like the Apple Podcasts and whatnot. They put out notifications and they're easy to use. They're on most people's devices by default, and it's just a really easy way to get through to people when you have serialized, episodic something. Which if you do put out something every week, it is. I mean, it's not serialized in that you need to listen to each week in order to understand what's happening, but it's just regular, I guess is the word I'm looking for. There's probably a more proper word for that, but that's what I'm going with. So the history of podcasts, just to go back into it a little bit, is the original RSS feed outline, the spec we call this. Now, spec is the rules by which some technology happens. The original rules that defined the RSS feed. So the rules that said when you create a podcast RSS feed, it has to look this way. So you have to have this and this that says this with this value. Like, so name and blah. Sorry, I'm getting too technical. I'm going to get off. Anyways, the spec was in 2000. The term podcast originally actually comes from iPod plus broadcast. So people were doing it on iPods a lot, and there were some independent developers who had some apps that were able to do it. Now, Apple at one point sued them all and got them to stop using iPod with it, and so now that's why it's entirely a podcast. But that's where the pod part of it comes from. It's actually from the original iPod, which, for some of the younger folk out there, and I found out that my youngest listener is actually 6 years old, and shout out to Lemmy, she's awesome. But, they aren't even going to know what an iPod was. So this was like a music device before the iPhones and stuff like that. And that's where the I in iPhone comes from, is from the I in iPod, which came from probably the I in I/me or something. So, they were originally independent developers, but then with the iTunes 4.9, Apple released the ability to listen to iPods directly. And that's really when they kicked off and launched hard. So, according to podcasthosting.org, there are 820,000 podcasts on the internet as of February 2020, which is also when I'm recording this. So, another site I found said 700,000, so, it's up for question, but it's a lot. That's one thing we can say. It's more than any of us are ever going to be listening to. And podcasthosting.org said there's 28 million episodes out there. And, this is just one of them. So thanks for listening to this one with a selection of 28 million. The fact that you're even this far into this one here, thanks. Anyways, and then for 51% of the U.S. population, 144 million people, which actually doesn't work out right because there's more people than that, but maybe that's listener age because you can't count babies or something. But anyways, 51% of the U.S. population, or 144 million, or maybe those somehow are the same, have listened to podcasts. 22% listen to podcasts weekly. And for listeners, it's roughly evenly balanced between men and women. This site said 54 to 46% male to female. I found another one that said actually 52% male, 48% male. So listeners are quite evenly balanced between the sexes. And the majority of listeners, 80%, are between 12 and 54 years old. Anyone 55 and over was quite a small percentage. They're not listening as much as the younger folks. So it does seem to be a medium that hits the younger age group seem to find appealing quite a bit. I also found some other facts, some other numbers, whether they're facts or not. There's over 100 languages that you can find podcasts in, and the average listener, I think this one was American, is listening to 6 hours and 37 minutes of podcasts a week. So that's like not what TV levels ever were or have been, but that is a lot of listening. 6 hours a week. I mean, it's quite a bit. So why do podcasts even matter? Like, what does it matter? And I'm going to get a little bit like more, I'm a bit of an optimist and stuff like that, and I like to look at stuff from a tech perspective as I do. And so I'm going to talk about why I think they matter. I think there's two issues here that need to be considered. One is that there's a lot of negativity on the internet. I think we all know that. And, the internet, it's a new communication tool. And, some people are like, well, it's not that new. It's 25 years. But if you look at, compare that to humanity, which is thousands of years or tens or I think maybe 50,000, but I'm really kind of not in my wheelhouse of numbers not right now. But we when you consider the 25 years that the internet's been around, where all of a sudden most of humanity suddenly has the ability to communicate with the most of the rest of humanity. 25 years is not long. And so we got this, like, we're still figuring it out. Now, I want, I think, well, at least people in my generation and older will know Lord of the Flies. Was a story and eventually a movie, I believe, as well, about a bunch of kids who get into a shipwreck or a plane crash. I can't remember exactly which, and end up on an island with no adults around, and everything descends into like tribes, and they're like violence, and I think there's murder at some point if I recall correctly, but then they get rescued after that, and it's a bit of a mess, but it's kind of like with the absence of people to teach them what to do, the kids go crazy. And it's not implausible. I don't know like exactly what that book was based on. I've taught children though, and I've been a child as have others, and you see like the things you read, and I mean, it's easy for the youth to, without guidance, do some mean stuff. And on that same note, the internet is the same. It's easy for people who, like, there's no boss, there's no guidance. So anytime you get anonymity, you get people doing stuff that's negative, and it's like, I'm gonna somewhat read the comments for this podcast, but one thing I'm gonna have to learn to do is turn off emotions, because if it goes as well as I hope it does, at some point I'm gonna have to deal with people saying some stuff that's really not all that nice, because you know what, there's stuff that can be said that's not nice about me, and that's part of the way the world works. But so I am pretty able to filter that out. I say now, early in my career as a content creator, but I think I should be okay. We'll see how it goes. But I that's me. Now, you imagine those kids in Lord of the Flies, they had no guidance, and so they went a little rough because they had no one teaching them the right way to do it, and they hadn't yet. If you left them and let them grow up, and then they had children, and then those children had children, eventually they're going to start to gain some structure and some rules and they're gonna start to have like cultural rules where when someone says something, they're gonna be like, they're gonna get struck down for it. But there's still gonna be some people, like that nasty guy who just never shuts up, and they maybe the crazy guy on the street, where unfortunately in some societies people just filter them out and ignore them, or in other societies people take care of them and put them in or give them care or whatnot. But it's we've learned to, as societies, how to deal with these things. But in the internet, we're these kids on the island. We got thrown the internet, and all of a sudden we can all talk to anyone. And there aren't a set of rules by which anyone ever knew how to communicate properly and effectively on the internet. All we just had was the ability to communicate. And what does that do? Well, it exposes a lot of negativity and bad stuff, but it also opens up the tool for a lot of good stuff. So I think, anyways, the point here being, those kids on the island, they never had guidance, and so they went off. But if over time they would develop it, because as society moves forward and grows, and you get cultural as well as legal rules, things start to get better. And so on the internet, we're still so new into it. So I'm going to give, some of these are touching onto other podcasts I'm going to do, but this is my Tek Talk, so hopefully maybe it'll filter out. Some people listen to the other ones, but the generation, the baby boomers, that's my parents' generation, they were the people who grew up before the internet was around, and when it came around, they were already essentially established in their ways, as it were. And so the internet was something, they are able to use it now to some degree, but they never have become adept at it for the most part. Of course, there are outliers, but for the most part, they have never become as adept at it as younger generations. And I think that's fair to say on a generational level. I mean, anytime if you start applying that to individuals, I know some very technically adept people who are baby boomers. The next generation in the generation list was Generation Xers, and that's me. I'm an X. And for me, the internet started in 1995 with Windows 95. And I'm going to keep this real short because this is actually a real part of a longer talk I'm going to do. But I consider 95 the start of the internet. So I was 19 years old at the time. Just gave away my age for anyone who wants to do the math. And so I knew how to live without the internet. And even though it came out in 95, I mean, it wasn't like it was now. It never really kicked in for about a good 10 years. Like 2005 is when things started really enrolling. I think Facebook is 2004. I mean, that kind of gives a bit of perspective. So we grew up, the Gen Xers, without the internet, and we know what it's like to, like, hang out and go camping without data and signal for the weekend and whatnot. But we were young enough when it came out that we've been able to use it pretty good. We were even the pioneers of it. But we never got any kind of teaching on how to do it, and it also wasn't that bad because it was still so new. But then we had kids. And some of the boomers did too, but they're the millennials. And the millennials got screwed because they got born to the internet. All of a sudden, this new communication tool that allows them all to talk with each other, but no one telling them how to do it and how to protect themselves. Not just from other people, but from their own dopamine, is what I have to say. How to protect themselves from their own dopamine, like that dopamine surge they get from everything. And they really got it rough. Fortunately, we're getting far enough in where they're having their own, like, turmoils, and they're starting to realize, one, that the world is kind of screwing them over a little bit, but two, that they're a mess from this internet thing. So they're growing the kids, or not growing the kids. Jeez, my lingo is horrendous here. They're having and raising the kids that are born into the internet, but are now, there's starting to become a semblance where their parents were born into it. And so they're starting to create these structures. And if you think of it, liken it to society, you can think of it as, say, like 100 years ago when, or whatever, like 1800s or whatever, when it's still kind of cowboy times. And how they're, originally it was the Wild West, and that's what we talk about, the old Wild West. But then, like, structure came in, and there started to be, like, police forces that enforced, and the gangs started to become lesser, and then we created, like, government and rules and military to enforce it on a national level, and police forces, and that, and along with that, we developed culture and what's appropriate and what's not, and so the same thing will happen with the internet. We'll learn to communicate on it. We just haven't yet. And so now we got this negativity on the internet. I talked about there being 2 points as to why I thought podcasts matter. And that's the first one, is there's this negativity. But I think podcasts really... Well, so let's talk about the other one. The other one is what I was talking about earlier, about bringing the power of the people into their hands. Anyone with a phone. Anyone with a computer can now record a podcast. And these two things are happening at the same time. And I think this is what changes it. So the internet, it's a little crazy right now. And at the same time, our entire planet is crazy because the internet it's a disruptor. Never, ever have all the people been able to talk to all the people. Never. Forever, all the people you talk to were your village. Okay, things got a little further. Maybe your village, and then maybe you'd hear the news from the village over, or maybe a couple villages over, or if it was big news, you'd hear it from like a few, like, halfway across the province or whatever. That's all you heard. But now we've got access to talk to everyone, but we've also got access to everyone's everything. And just how the same way that, well, no, not the same way. Back in the day, if you heard something emotionally disturbing, you would hear it periodically because it's not going to happen that often in your village or in the neighboring villages. And so you paid the emotional price when you heard stuff. You'd be afraid and blah, blah, but, it only happened periodically. Of course, you had other stuff to worry about, like, your village being raped and pillaged or whatever, but let's just move on past that for the moment. And so then... sorry, the point I was getting at here was that's how it was back then, and then things got more stable. So same with the internet, as we start to develop cultural rules, like, actual legal rules, although I personally am for an open internet where we actually don't, and we just learn how to communicate properly and filter out the crap rather than actually, like, eliminating them to some degree. It's impossible to eliminate everything. There's a dark web, blah, blah, blah. That's a whole line of thought I'm not going to go on what I'm talking about right now, because I'm going to keep on going on with what I was talking about. So the point here I have is that I think the awesome thing is the masses now have the power to talk to each other. Of course, this can be used for bad as well. It can be used to promote hate hate speech and everything like that. But podcasts just is the internet or a tool. And I think they're a great tool. And while it's created disruption and craziness now, I think podcasts are the way that they're the stabilizer amongst this like crazy fluctuation of everything that we have, because they do allow people to talk and discuss, but also to humor, but also to promote ideas, and you can listen to other people talk about ideas. And of course that does sometimes create echo chambers where people just listen to things that they already believe, and it's confirmation bias, and they just further believe the things they already believe without like realizing that there's another side. But again, that's something that I think as we get further on, we'll start to teach each other not to do, like careful of that. And I think we already do hear a lot of talk about confirmation bias in the media these days. People are starting to recognize it as a thing in these echo chambers. So I think podcasts are really like for the masses to communicate. They're just an awesome thing. They're just like, and there will be a tool, but as we learn to use the internet better, we'll figure out how to filter out the crap, the wheat from the chaff, as it were, and you'll just start to ignore those guys who are talking the stuff, and the people who have things that are good to say will be heard and listened to by the masses, and they won't be corporate driven, or sometimes it will. Sorry, I shouldn't say it won't be, but you know, it can be not corporate driven. It can be entirely purely ideological, if so that's what someone wants, or just for fun or whatever. For me, it's a creative outlet, and that's what I'm doing. So as far as how podcasts go, how they're promoted, you know, nowadays it's all, well, there's a couple things. It's first on the podcast directories like iTunes and everything. When I upload a new podcast, notifications will go to subscribers of my podcast. So anytime someone subscribes, that's how they find out about it. And the way these systems are all interlinked, I upload a podcast to my site, which automatically adds it to the document, which Apple automatically checks after so long, which Apple automatically then says whoosh, and sends it out to all my subscribers that, hey, this guy's got a new podcast. Google's doing the same thing for me on their thing, and then so are all the other ones. So that's kind of how they're promoted as far as there's a new episode out there, which is nice, because that it's a way for the common man, the layman that doesn't have any money or anything like that. And right now, me, as I'm doing this podcast on this iPhone, that's a way for us to get our stuff out to everyone and let them know that it's out there. And then you could also do like nowadays, if you want to really promote it, you got to do social media, you got to do Twitter, you got to do Facebook, the Instagram, and you want to have those things both. You want to post your new episodes on there, but maybe things you're interested in. For me, on my friendly-outsider.com Instagram, I'm gonna have pictures of like Vancouver and stuff, and when I travel places I go, but I'm also gonna put up videos like stuff that won't necessarily be a podcast, but it's about, still part of my entire creative outlet. So a podcast nowadays, initially it was just this audio file, but a podcast nowadays has grown to encompass so much more than just that. And so you got your regular social media like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, maybe TikTok. Maybe the kids are using. I hear about this one. I've never even looked at it, but I'm not too sure. But I'm sure you could. You can also do marketing campaigns, and there's MailChimp is a marketing campaign tool which you can do, and people subscribe for it. It's for subscribers, and they can unsubscribe for it. So it's not intrusive. People only get it if they want. And it's an easy way for podcast distributors to put out things and see like what the response is. So if they do have a new blog post go out, they can see like what kind of people listen to it, and you can get metrics on it and stuff like that. So that's ways podcasts are promoted, and how they're financially incentivized. Well, there's advertising. So some people do like on-site advertising. They'll have like, if it's a YouTube, they'll have like ads on their YouTube thing which break in, or they might have a website on which they have advertising. A lot of podcasters are doing embedded ads where they actually read out ads as part of a read of their podcast. So to start, they'll say, the sponsor for this podcast is so-and-so, and they're sponsoring us for blah, 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 blah. You can listen to them. And then they say their name 400 times, so they get stuck in your brain. And then you know that if you need to hire someone, you can go to, and I'm not going to say it, but you can know that I have that site stuck in my head from hearing it so many times from those recruiters. Oh, I even gave away a little bit of a hint there. So, other things, and some podcasts are doing events now. Like, so the podcast group or the person or whatever it is, they'll go and do live events with people, and they'll record it. Or they don't even necessarily record it. They just go meet up with people. I mean, you can do whatever you want, really. And then a lot of these guys will also sell merchandise. So, these podcasts, they get memes going with them as they get followers and people who listen to them and like them. If they sometimes get jokes, they'll make a t-shirt that follows along with those jokes, and their listeners like to support them, so they buy it, especially when they come to the event. So the last interesting way that podcasts can be financially incentivized is through Patreon. So Patreon is an interesting thing. It's the way it works is content creators, and that's YouTubers and podcasters like myself and whoever. I mean, it can be any kind of content creation, blogs if you want. You create a Patreon account and then you post a link to your Patreon account on your website. And people who would like to patronize, but not in the looking down upon way, but rather the financially support way, can patronize your content. And so some people will donate, say, like, $1 or $5 for each time you release a podcast, or maybe a podcast on certain content. And or they might just do a one-time only donation of $10, or they might do $5 a month just to keep you going, to keep people motivated on a financial level so that they're not struggling to do their podcasts. Patreon also allows you to do things like set like financial goals for the month and or tiers, so that you can actually have custom content that only goes out to specific people who have donated a given amount. So this is how people are making money off podcasts. And I believe that really brings to the end of my talk. I talked about, what podcasts are and how they're marketed and what they are actually technologically underneath. It's a thing I obviously feel strongly about, being a podcaster. And as I said, you can check out everything on my podcast. You can find it at friendly-outsider.com. And yeah, please subscribe, like, give me comments, any of that stuff, because the more buzz you generate, the more something. Either way, I'm the Friendly Outsider, and I've enjoyed this first ever Tek Talk that I've done. I'm going to have more to come, and I'm going to be talking about more stuff as well as I go forward. So hope you're having a good day. I'm going to try and enjoy myself in this beautiful but cold, snowy Canadian weather, and I'll talk to you guys later. I'm out.